their mission really was different than ours. Our mission was to get to the truth. Their mission was to protect the president at all costs. And that was a fatal flaw from the beginning.
Welcome to NightCAP. It's April 12th.
Time for your weekly dose of commentary, analysis, and politics. I'm Fallon Gallagher.
And I'm James Duran.
Thanks for joining us. And you were just watching a clip of Congressman Adam Schiff reflecting on the House Intel Committee's investigation into the alleged Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Congressman Schiff is the ranking Democrat on the House Intel Committee and has been the face of the investigation after Committee Chairman Devin Nunes had to recuse himself last year. We sat down with Congressman yesterday for an exclusive interview to discuss the Russia issue. Let's take a look. We know that the House Intel investigation of the alleged Russian meddling in the 2016 election has ended. You were the head, the ranking Democrat on that committee. So can you tell us about how you think that investigation went and how you think it ended?
Well, it's interesting. The Republicans have said that they're ending their participation in the Russia investigation. On the Democratic side, though, we're going to plow forward because we realize just how much work has been left undone. Indeed, every day new evidence comes to light that shows just how poor a decision it was for the majority to drop the investigation. And indeed, on the majority side, they're not really ending their work. They're just ending their work on the part of the investigation that the American people care so much about, and that is what Russia did, what the Trump campaign did in combination with Russia. But they continue to do a counter investigation of the FBI, of the Department of Justice. Just yesterday, our chairman threatened potentially to impeach the director of the FBI. All of that is an effort to protect the president by essentially putting the government on trial. And unfortunately, the end of their work on the Russia part of the investigation is much like the beginning of their work on the Russia investigation. Their purpose really was protecting the president, not finding out what happened. Now, we learned a lot nonetheless about many secret meetings and conversations that the Trump campaign had with the Russians, offers of Russian help, offers that were accepted by the Trump campaign, the delivery of help by the Russians, but there's still a lot more to investigate. And even now we learn of witnesses that testified before our committee that may have perjured themselves. So a lot more work remains to be done.
For more on this, we'd like to bring in our panel, both NightCAP veterans. We're now joined by Kimberly Rum and Graham Ferguson. Thanks so much for being back here at the round table.
Thanks for joining us, guys. So certainly, some things in that clip that are pretty surprising, pretty shocking, I think. And we were talking, before the show, most people really don't know all the details. But what were your big takeaways from that first clip, Kimberly?
Well, I just think one of my biggest takeaways would be the polar opposite kind of views among the Democrats and the Republicans, with the Democrats viewing so much work left to be done in this investigation, whereas the Republicans obviously wanting to halt that investigation, as we saw with the end of the House Intelligence Committee's investigation into the Russian probe. So I just think seeing kind of the polarization that is existing among the different parties, that was what I found to be the most compelling.
Graham, how about you?
Yeah, my gut reaction, first of all, is this is clearly not like your typical investigation. It seems as though the investigation is really primarily out to protect the president, as Schiff said. I think with the chairman, threatening to potentially impeach the director of the FBI. This is like a big deal. This is something that certainly, I know it's been talked about before, but this could be getting close to obstruction of justice, just the way this has been handled. And like Kim was saying, just the partisan aspect of this is certainly a problem. And so it'd be interesting to see how things shake out in the future.
And that makes me wonder how things might have changed if this wasn't an investigation that happened along partisan lines. I wonder, do you think that the fact that these House and Senate investigations where you have a chairman who's of one party and a ranking member of another party and things are pretty split along partisan lines, if that decreases the quality of the investigation?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it all plays out. I think the president too right now is obviously very wary of people coming after him specifically. You can see just the shuffling that's going on in his cabinet. I think that's something that's really hitting him hard. And so people in the cabinet too are getting wary of what they say as well. But it'll be interesting to see how things kind of shake out with this investigation, especially with Trump starting to now think that Mueller's kind of overstepped his boundaries, going after his attorney, stuff like that.
So I think we want to talk a little bit more about that procedural part of it, Fallon.
Yeah.
So we have we have another clip actually to show you on that subject. Let's take a look.
Congressman Jim Himes also recently said that this investigation has spent more time in the news than it probably should have. Do you agree with this assessment, and do you think that it hurt the credibility of your and your Democratic colleagues trying to make this case?
Well, I don't agree with that in the sense that the only tool that the Democratic members had to expose what the committee was doing, what it wasn't doing, the leads that we were not following, was to do so through the media. And it was very important, I think, to bring the American people into this investigative process, let them know what was being done in their name, and most importantly, what was not being done, the leads we were not allowed to pursue. If the Russians hold leverage over the President of the United States, the American people need to know it. It's a national security priority and urgency.
So, Kimberly, we've seen Congressman Schiff on TV a lot. He's frequently on MSNBC and CNN. Do you agree that he thinks it's important that this investigation should have been so involved in the media the way it was?
Absolutely. I think it speaks to the fact that transparency is key. And I mean, we're talking about like the national security of our entire country. And I think that the American people deserve to know what really happened. And I think the fact that there is this lack of a consensus within Congress about how this investigation should be handled has made things incredibly difficult. But generally speaking, yes, I do think the American people deserve to know. And obviously having the platform of social media just allows the American people to get an inside look.
Well, Graham, I think Kimberly makes a good point, but I do want to say it's difficult to just say, obviously we all want transparency, but as we talked about, there really were two different sets of facts in this investigation, the way that it went. So is that part of the problem? Is that essentially, Congressman Schiff certainly very intelligent and knows what he's talking about, but the amount of time that he and his colleagues are on TV sort of talking the story up, is that productive?
Yeah, I mean, I think what he touches on here, though, is that it's really it's the American people's right to know this stuff. I think this is something that's very pertinent right now. I mean, this was the biggest election that we have as a country. I mean, this is something that impacts every single American here, and so I feel like it is absolutely our right to know. I think that at times obviously, I have issues with the media and how the media handles things. I feel like a lot of things get blown out of proportion. But this is one of those things that I feel like people need to know about. People need to hear about. This needs to be one of the headlines.
Yeah, that was definitely the point he was making.
Right, and something that we've been hearing about a lot this week is the possibility of Special Counsel Mueller being fired by President Trump. So Congressman Schiff also spoke about that. Let's take a look.
Moving on a little bit to the other investigation, or one of the remaining investigations, the two actually. So the Senate Intel Committee and Special Counsel Mueller continue to investigate, certainly from every angle as it seems, and reports this week that the president is fuming again. Sort of his rage at Special Counsel Mueller seems to have sort of peaked back up. Does it seem like he is closer than he has been previously to making that fateful mistake of firing the special counsel? And if so, where do you lie in terms of how you feel about your Republican colleagues handling that if it goes down that awful road?
I'm deeply concerned that the president could be on the precipice of firing Mueller or firing Rosenstein as a way of constraining what Mueller can do. Now, whether he's closer to that point than he has in the past, he actually apparently ordered Mueller fired.
Right.
And it was only because the White House counsel, Doug McGahn, refused to carry out that order happen. So he may be as close as he was then. I would hope not, for the sake of the Republic. I think it would cause a constitutional crisis. I think it would be a clear act of obstruction of justice. In terms of what my GOP colleagues would do, I have to say, in the House, I'm deeply worried because they have been largely mute. The only voices in opposition to this really have come from the Senate. And the example that the House Republicans give of shutting down not only the Russia investigation in the House, or at least they're part of it, but the only investigation in the House of the administration, that sends a message to the president that, well, heck, if the Republicans in the House don't think the investigation should go any further, then they can't complain if I fire Mueller and don't allow his investigation to go any further. So the House has set a terrible example.
And reading between the lines, it seems as if he's flirting with the idea of sort of a halfway step of Rosenstein, as you mentioned. So we'll be sure to watch that.
And going back,
that's a deep concern as well, for the reason that Rosenstein is Bob Mueller's boss, and Rosenstein decides what the scope of Bob Mueller's investigation may be. And if he is replaced by someone who is nothing more than a yes man for the president, that person can tell Bob Mueller, you cannot look at money laundering, you can't look at this issue, you need to wrap up this or you need to wrap up that. And those decisions would not be disclosed to the public. It would be a clandestine way, really, to try to hobble the Mueller investigation, and that's a deep concern.
Certainly, and Graham, you know, we all saw the Michael Cohen news this week. Does it seem to you like this time might be different in terms of Trump does seem to be pretty close to the precipice of firing Bob Mueller? And you know, if so, what do you think that means going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly this is a next step. I think this is, I mean, Trump already does seem pretty upset with what's going on. I think this is definitely pushing him closer to the edge. I mean, I know Newt Gingrich came out and said recently that, you know, Rosenstein's really, you know, overstepping his boundaries here. He's supposed to be keeping Mueller on watch. And clearly that's not really, doesn't really seem to be the case, at least according to the president. But I do honestly think like all this is fair game. I mean, this has to happen. This is, the American people are owed sort of the truths in this. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kimberly, your thoughts on that?
I mean, we live in a democracy, not a dictatorship, and if you just have the president who's going to go ahead and either fire Bob Mueller or Rosenstein just because he doesn't like the direction of the investigation, I mean, that's very alarming to me and should be alarming to the entire American populace.
Certainly. I want to take a quick step back because we've been kind of in the weeds with all this, and I realize not everybody's as tuned into this investigation as we are, the four of us. So we also talked to Congressman Schiff about the specifics of this investigation and what the average American needs to know. Let's take a look.
Talking about the intricacies of the Russians' efforts to interfere, and particularly those indictment documents of the 13 Russian citizens, which was stunning in its detail and sophistication. You know, for those of us who are very tuned into this and we sort of follow this, like the three of us, for example, you know, we sort of understand, I think, the broad strokes at least. How would you explain, though, the severity and sort of that level of sophistication I mentioned to folks who aren't as tuned into this, who may not see this as the dire issue that I think we all do?
Well, the indictment was remarkable, as you say, for the extraordinary level of detail, including communications between people working at that troll farm and family members, the monthly budget, the number of people working there, the hierarchy of positions. The Russians sought to manipulate our citizens in the election. All sorts of Americans got involved in local efforts because they thought they were indigenous to their community and not driven out of St. Petersburg. So they were very effective on social media. They were very effective, obviously, in the hacking and dumping operation. There's no greater proof of the significance of that than the fact that the president would refer to these Russian hacked documents about 135 times during the last weeks of the campaign. So clearly the president thought that this Russian delivered information was very useful to his campaign. But we also ought to be aware of the broader significance of what the Russians did. And that is, yes, they had a preferred candidate in Donald Trump, and yes, they didn't want Hillary Clinton, but more fundamentally, they sought to sow discord in the United States, to undermine our democracy as part of a global effort to undermine the idea of liberal democracy.
All right, so Kimberly, Congressman Schiff just laid out the specifics of what exactly this Russia investigation is. We hear Russia all the time. Now we kind of know what it is. Do you think that if more ordinary Americans understood what exactly the Russia investigation meant, they would care more? I mean, we were talking about how few people are tuned into this.
I think absolutely. I mean, on one hand, I think you have viewers seeing the headlines, reading about the Russian investigation that are just going to shake their head and think, oh, it's a witch hunt. And then on the other hand, you have people who are more in tune with the nuances of the investigation, recognizing its implications. But I think maybe if this investigation was broken down into more simpler terms and spelled out why it is so important, why there should be transparency, I think you would have a lot more interested viewers who would become more informed about, you know, the importance of the investigation.
Certainly, and even the jargon. I mean, I wonder how many people know what the word collusion means, for
well,
example.
And not a legal term. I mean, it really is just being thrown around like candy. But you know, certainly, Graham, there is a third group, right? Kimberly mentioned two groups. There's a third group of folks who are kind of already made the decision in their mind that Trump is guilty, right? And so I think that's sort of the trouble here is, you know, certainly we want people to understand the severity of it, and I think the indictment document of the 13 Russians is probably the best place to start. But is it also important to keep this in context, right? There's still no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian actors. Is that lost in all of this?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say at this point. I mean, I think there's just so much out there right now. Obviously, the media is kind of having somewhat of a frenzy with it. But you look at, I mean, even Don Jr.'s involvement. You look at, like you said, the 13. I think those are all signs point to yes. It's something that I think a lot of Americans. It's a very polarizing issue, obviously, because our president seems to be. It seems to be at the forefront of what he's trying to do right now, and definitely consuming him. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. We'll see. It'd be interesting to see how this sort of plays out if we start getting any more, forms of evidence that start coming through. It's difficult to say.
And for the people who don't buy it, right? The people who think this is a hoax, this is a scam.
Witch hunt,
people
some
who vilify Adam Schiff, for example. Why do you think it is? I mean, certainly it's a direct indictment of the president, but why isn't it registering for more people in your mind? I mean, you look at even all Americans, right? Not just Republicans. The Russia issue is not at the top of the list of the most important issues for people, right? It's the kitchen table issues, so to speak. Why do you think that is? Why isn't it registering if it is so serious?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with people are skeptical right now. I think there's so little trust in the media, and there's so little trust in what gets thrown out into the public arena and in space and in what you take in. People don't know what to believe, and I feel like in a country that's becoming increasingly polarized, I think this is sort of a lot of people, at least on Trump's side of the issue, see it as a distraction. I think on the other side, it seems like this is the biggest thing we have to deal with right now. This is something that's affecting every single American. I mean, 2016 was a huge election, momentous for our country, and so I do think a lot of people see it as a distraction now, and I think that a lot of people want to kind of move past that. But we'll see what happens next.
Certainly, well said. Well, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to have more of our interview with Congressman Schiff. Stay tuned.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Welcome back. So far, we've been discussing the meddling in the 2016 election, but 2018, this year, is also an election year. We talked to the congressman about the potential for future meddling in this year's midterms. Let's take a look at that clip. This attack that allegedly happened in the 2016 election cycle, but looking ahead to the future, we have Trump appointees like Dan Coats who have said this is not a one and done thing. This is most likely going to happen again in 2018. From your perspective, what steps would be sufficient enough for the Trump administration and Congress to take to make sure that this type of an attack on our democracy doesn't happen again in the next election cycle?
Well, what's happening right now is I think the states are taking this seriously, and they're trying to harden their defenses. And there are people at kind of a mid-level within the bureaucracy of the Federal Department of Homeland Security and other agencies that are working on this with the states. But what we are lacking is two very significant things. The first is a whole of government response in which every cabinet member is looking at the agencies within their jurisdiction and working together to determine how do we protect our country? How do we establish a deterrent to what the Russians did? How do we establish a quick response? What are we going to do in the cyber realm to protect ourselves? What kind of coordination do we have between the intel community and our state elections officials so they don't have to wait a year after the election to find out the Russians were probing? We need to develop a national consensus that if any foreign power interferes in our affairs again, that we will all reject it, Democrats and Republicans, no matter who it benefits. But we can't get to that consensus as long as the president refuses to accept it even happened. The president tweeted just today that the relations with Russia are at its poorest ebb because of the Russia investigation. Only someone that is a true classic narcissist could believe that's the case. It's not the investigation, Mr. President. It's the Russian violation of our sovereignty that poisoned the relations with our countries. It's their support of Assad, who's gassing his own people. It's their invasion of their neighbor. It's not the fact that Congress is doing its job and that Bob Mueller is doing his job. And the fact that our president doesn't understand that means that the country is not going to come to that consensus we need to reject foreign interference in our affairs.
So, Graham, Congressman Schiff was talking about this whole government approach where in order to really fix this, he'd have to be on the same page as his cabinet secretaries, Congress. Why do you think he's not doing that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I love what the congressman had to say. I think this whole idea of unity when it comes to this, I mean, this should be a common enemy. This should be something we can get behind.
Yeah, absolutely
look at the trouble in the Middle East with Syria. Look at meddling in the election. All of it adds up. Like, this is something that should be very bipartisan. I love hearing that he's saying that. I think that's really important. But when it comes to his cabinet, it's just been in such flux right now. I think people in his cabinet are scared of the president, quite frankly. I think the way that he, got rid of Tillerson so recently.
Well, and the turnover, it's hard to almost get involved and do something about Russia when you're out the door and fired by a tweet.
Right, and you just don't have the time to react, the time to really get stuff done.
Well, and one thing we talked about that I don't think we showed is a lot of these cabinet secretaries, as you say, Fallon, are concerned about their job security, and the Russia conversation is not one that they want to have with the president, given that.
A little bit of a touchy subject.
But Kimberly, one thing that I thought was important, as Graham said, I also appreciated the way that Congressman Schiff sort of talked about the issue, and what he said as well was that really the primary goal of the Russians was to create chaos, and I think unfortunately Trump sees it as any movement, any action on the issue is a concession that they were trying to elect him, when really their primary goal, it seems, was to create chaos. And so is that an element of it that I think we're missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that's overlooked is the fact that the success that, the Russian interference has had in creating such chaos speaks to kind of the underlying discord and, fragility that exists in our country to begin with. And I think that's an issue that has been overlooked and needs to be addressed, because we live in a nation where there is discord and where there needs to be more.
And that's exactly what they wanted.
Exactly.
Right.
But the fact that they were able to kind of take advantage of that discord that already exists.
Right. And I think that's important. They want Schiff and Trump head to head. They want these conflicts playing out on TV, playing out in front of the American people. That was their goal in the end. But we want to take another look. We asked him about new National Security Advisor John Bolton, and let's take a quick look at that. John Bolton's first day was 2 days ago. I'm curious. I think you and most Democrats, frankly myself, disagree with his views on almost everything. But I am curious, is there a silver lining? Is he someone who at the very least is clear-eyed about Russia, what Putin wants to do, and sort of what they represent as a foreign adversary?
Well, I think he's been hawkish on Russia as he's been hawkish on just about everything else. And I appreciate you're looking for a silver lining, because believe me, I've been looking for one. I had a friend ask me the other day what I thought of Michael Bolton being named National Security Advisor. And I said, I think you mean John Bolton, but honestly, Michael Bolton would be great. I would much rather have Michael Bolton. How often can you say the country would be better off if Michael Bolton were the National Security Advisor? So it deeply worries me, both because he is such a warmonger, and proudly so, but also because he lacks the temperament to be a National Security Advisor, where you're supposed to be bringing people together within the cabinet, hashing out the best approaches to difficult problems, presenting a set of alternatives to the president. That is not in his nature.
We also asked the congressman about his colleague Paul Ryan's retirement announcement. He described it as what he said, quote, "The captain is jumping off a sinking ship." But James, you have some thought on that characterizations? Pretty bold.
Yeah, so Fallon, since our last show about a month ago, there have been some major movement in the generic ballot polling, with the average of these national polls converging now into a single-digit advantage for a generic Democrat. Of course, we were looking at a spread of plus 15, even higher in January.
I think we have a graphic for that.
I think we do. Looking at a little bit more of a NightCAP polling graphic. Looking at Quinnipiac, though, who released new numbers yesterday, they had it Dems plus 17 in January. This week, just plus 3. That's probably a little lower than what it really is, but the average has been steadily coming down, is now around plus 7. The trend lines, which we have on the screen here, of other key questions down the questionnaire should be very worrying for Democrats, I think. They track with a tightening midterm outlook. First, the image of the Democratic Party is right around its low, going back 10 years at minus 20, suggesting Republican messaging might be working, the threat of impeachment painting them all as far left. And you can see that the view of the Republican Party is not much worse at minus 26, certainly not what you'd like to see if you're a Democrat. And then, of course, these economic questions, the state of the economy. The percentage of registered voters who describe the state of the economy as excellent or good is around its high in the history of Quinnipiac asking that question. Same goes for how voters describe their personal financial situation. Did someone say tax cuts? Meanwhile, voters believe now more than at any other point in the Trump presidency that Trump is responsible for the current state of the economy, as opposed to Obama when asked that way. Take it all together, you have a clear picture of an improving situation for Republicans in the midterms. But of course, Fallon, it's all about losing the least amount of seats possible. They will still lose a bunch of seats.
Don't you just love getting a lot of numbers thrown at you really fast? We'll be right back with more of the speakers'
That's why people watch.
Comments. Speaker Paul Ryan announced his retirement yesterday, and Politico magazine is already out with a new piece titled "The Tragedy of Paul Ryan," highlighting the change in Ryan's politics over his over 2-decade career in Congress.
Yeah, so there'll be a lot of time after he's done, after he heads home to dissect his legacy. But I do think Tim Alberta mostly gets it right in that piece. I'd highly recommend reading it. But the consequences of this decision for the Republican Party, I think, are significant. Whatever you think of his politics, whatever you think of his approach to Trump, I think Paul Ryan's one of the most intelligent congressmen, politicians we've really seen, at least in our lifetimes. And at the end of the day, really a good guy and a great public servant who didn't even want the speakership. So I think it's important to keep that in mind before we start lambasting him for not opposing the president at every turn. Politically, Speaker Ryan, one of the most effective party leaders we've ever had in terms of campaigning, what he's done with funding the CLF, the NRCC, almost single-handedly doing so. So this is a major morale hit, I think, and we're going to get into that with Graham in a minute here. They really do want all hands on deck. And he said, of course, that he's doing this for his family. He wants to see his kids grow up, and I think we should take him at his word on that. But, of course, folks like us who were a little skeptical. Of course, President Trump certainly played a factor. The fact that he probably has a lucrative career lined up with regular hours where he doesn't have to commute to D.C. probably sounds pretty good compared to dealing with the president on a daily basis.
Wow, you just wrapped up a whole career real fast.
I don't think I gave him enough credit. But Graham,
all right.
briefly want to get your thoughts.
One quick question, Graham.
Briefly want to get your thoughts on Speaker Ryan's announcement.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like a lot of people early on when he started rising up, I was a big fan when he came to the national stage in mainly 2012. But I do think he's really left a bad taste in my mouth as of recent. I think that moving forward, we'll see what he does after this, but don't really like how he stooped.
That's fair.
All right.
Kimberly, we want to get to your in case you missed it. What do you got for us?
Well, in case you missed it, we've learned today that Trump is now reconsidering entering the U.S. back into the TPP, something that was...
Oh boy. I missed that, actually.
It was something that he was vehement about, the United States exiting, and we left the TPP in his first week as president, but today he's been talking to economic advisors.
It's almost like the TPP was good policy. Graham, what do you got for us?
Real fast.
So there was a New York Times article published 2 days ago talking about Trump's tariffs and how it's impacting a particular steel company in Pennsylvania. There are massive losses. This smaller company is losing $500,000 over the course of the next 6 months. So it's kind of ironic that these tariffs are actually hurting the people that voted for Trump.
All right, James, you texted me a pretty wild URL today.
Quickly, yeah, lioncomey.com, in my opinion, the most disgusting thing that the RNC has ever done. I just really don't know what to say about it. Go check it out, I guess. I don't really want to give them any more clicks, to be honest, so maybe don't go check it out. Really just awful stuff. Fallon, what do you got?
So we actually made some news in our interview with Congressman Schiff today. We couldn't fit it into the show, but something you definitely won't see on MSNBC or CNN, and something that really upsets James. If you want to see what that news was, you can head over to our Instagram page at NightCapNU for a special proposal that Congressman Schiff has to increase youth voter turnout.
Oh, sounds terrible.
All right, well,
Can't
if you
have
have
that.
something great that we missed, you can tweet at us at NightCapNU. And Congressman Schiff didn't break any news about any plans of higher office, but like we said, you can catch that full interview on our Facebook page right here on Facebook. We will be back with more NightCap. Actually, we will not be back with more NightCap until next week. That's all the time we have. We want to thank both Graham and Kimberly again.
As well as Congressman Schiff.
Yeah, thank you so much to Congressman Schiff. If that wasn't enough of a NightCap, what time is it?
8:30. Plenty of time to keep talking. Thanks, and we'll see you next Thursday.
Thanks for joining us.